Hi, I'm Unju.
Hi, I'm Rishi.
This is Ihong. We're part of Group 1, and this is our e-learning presentation for designing from affinities and modules from the Euchre course. So in redesigning our lesson, we went through a pretty simple process, which was to move from our goal to data and assessment, and finally to instruction. However, if you take a closer look at that process, it gets pretty complicated. It also starts to look like something we're pretty familiar with, which is the big picture of this class. Anyways, let's take you through the design process. The first step was improving our goals and our learning objectives. Our original goal was to experience the end products of a contextual design session. This goal is pretty vague and not well defined, and we're not really sure what it meant. So to improve it, we applied three concepts to reconfigure our goals: KLI knowledge components, Bloom's taxonomy, and theoretical CTA. From each of these three things, we learned three different we learned three different objectives, and we asked different questions. How can we best design a goal that addresses specific KLI KC categorizations, and what kind of cognitive processes do we expect from our students? How can our goals reflect these cognitive processes? What intermediate steps do our students need to reach to achieve our final learning objective? These are all questions that we needed to ask ourselves in redesigning our learning objectives. Our new goal and learning objectives were the following. One, that students should be able to identify breakdowns from the flow model to make design decisions. And two, that students should be able to distinguish what method could be used to improve the breakdowns found in the flow model. We also identified skills for the students to understand that they needed to learn. Our second step was cognitive task analysis, in which we collected data from both experts and novices. We did this through structured interviews and think alouds, extracting knowledges from both experts and novices to understand different things. One was extracting knowledge from an expert, and that informed our instruction. We talked to Dr. Vincent Alevin in particular. The second was to understand user process and user confusion, especially from novices. And from here, we heavily modified and influenced questions to reflect what we learned here. What we learned from the structured interview was that students have difficulty in identifying what is important and what is noise, the general steps of accurately interpreting data, and that we should focus practice on where it is most difficult to learn. What we learned from Think Alouds was that students have difficulty understanding the model and contextualizing it, that they have difficulty distinguishing between breakdowns and obstructions, and that they have difficulty linking transcripts to correct model interpretations. From here, we learned three different things, which are on the screen. We also learned to decompose the big question into small sections and instruct students to work through step by step. This is reflected in pretty much all of our summative questions. Finally, we learned a few knowledge components. One, knowledge of work models. Two, understanding context. Three, prioritizing relevance. And four, knowledge of a breakdown.
So, from the result of the cognitive task analysis, we made changes to our assessments and started to design our instructions. Firstly, based on our CTA findings, students lack prerequisite knowledge needed for completing the application questions. There are a lot more factual knowledge needed before teaching the skills and principles. That's why we created a submodule to serve for this purpose. The intention was to get students to shift the focal points from the model to what's providing context to the model as an incremental step. So, how our assessments align with our goal? Remember that one of our goal is students should be able to identify breakdowns from the flow model to make design decisions. So, to align with it, our first part of our assessments are tests on intermediate knowledge that are needed to achieve the final goal, and another part is directly about when given a flow model and the original transcript, students will be asked where and what are the breakdowns. For example, like this and like this. And also about how our instruction align with the goal. We basically have three type of instructions. First, the video that gives a general understanding of the topic and the problem's goal. And also we create some slides that summarize the readings and are about the basic knowledge that are needed to achieve the final goal. And finally, we go to the formative assessment, acting as a kind of instruction that decompose the whole question into small sections and instruct students to do it step by step. Things like this, the video, the slides. We made it because students just don't have time to go through all the readings, they're too long. And the formative assessment, we broke the one original question into 17 intermediate small sections. Generally, it includes three steps among them. The first one is to understand the model, to find the major structure in a bunch of graphics. Like here, there are two major connections of the ticket buyer. And also the second step, to distinguish between a breakdown and an obstruction. Like we will ask students for each of this transcript, like will the system still function or it cannot function if the statement in this particular transcript doesn't work well. So students can learn how to analyze all of this transcript one by one and determine whether they're important or they're not. And we come to the final step, that is to locate the breakdowns you found on the map. So students will be able to locate the breakdowns like this. However, due to the constraints of the OLI platform, we can only do it in form of the multiple choice questions.
All right, so now getting more into the data and the findings. So this is a table that depicts all the that depicts all the number of questions in each section and the average rate at which students were able to successfully answer each all the questions. So the average correct rate for each of the models are depicted here. You can notice an incremental trend, however, that's purely coincidental because a lower correct rate does not equate higher difficulty. A, because these modules are completely independent from one another, and B, because they had different kinds of questions. So sometimes MCQs are easier to eliminate, select all the questions are harder to score on. Now looking at the performance metrics itself, there's a huge there's a huge difference between the pre-test and the post-test scores. So the pre-test is currently at around 0.31, whereas our post-test scores are at around 0.74. That's 74% versus 31% on the pre-test. The minimum score that we got was in the pre-test it was 0, on the post-test it was around 40%, and the max that we got on the pre-test was 90 and 100 on the post-test. Now, talking in terms of statistical significance, the the standard deviation of the difference between the pre-test and the post-test came out around 0.34, and with a degree of freedom of 21, we reached a p-value of 5.29, which when you equate it, brings us to a p-value for the null hypothesis to be 0.000015. So yeah, it's not a coincidence. And as an interesting note, our outlier of 4 out of 15 was unable to access OLAM. So her score is approximately 2.3 standard deviations below those who received immediate feedback on their answers, and that just showcases the how powerful immediate feedback can really be. Now, thinking about what we could have done iteratively, so most of our iterations occurred during the think aloud and the CTA process. So we designed this a different formative assessment on that point when we realized that there were a lot of pain points. And based on preliminary user feedback on pre and post test modules, we changed the answer key to 1 to better accommodate more answers. And unfortunately, due to the constraints posed by OLA itself, we weren't able to change formative assessments in more than a few ways that we wanted. And in hindsight, what could we have done differently? So there, as discussed earlier, there were a couple of errors. So in page 2 of our OLAM module, there are some errors with feedback messages, and there's an error in one question of the module, which I would like to fix later on. And some general quotes and feedbacks from our users. Our users really liked about the way our course was structured. They could see why each section was relevant and how it all tied in together towards the end. Most of the feedback was positive. Some feedback was kind of negative. And now when we think about the future improvements, we ideally would like to do more iterations to OLI post our data collection session, because that really gave us like the most insights about what we need to improve on. 73% is good, but we believe we can do better. So along those lines, we'd like to again test more users. We'd like to find out interview additional subject matter experts so that we can like incorporate even more points than we did. We'd like to ideally do this on one uniform platform. We'd like a greater variety of questions in our summative assessment, and finally a qualitative check of content before publishing on each iteration. That is a must. All right, thank you very much.